Right, for the people who are sticking around next year, I thought I'd give an overview of what the year is likely to map out to be in terms of the three philosophers I'm going to address, Spinoza, Kant and Schopenhauer. I may produce another podcast this year on Spinoza's treatment of imagination, but then that will be it, and I'm going to take a couple of weeks break. Anyway, when we get into 2019, I'll be continuing with Spinoza. I shall be launching into part 2, the dreaded part 2. And that will probably take a month at least. And then I shall go on to part 1, which will be February sometime. And then part 5, which will take probably a couple of months, so April, May. We won't be done with we'll never be done with Spinoza, but because of course there are other works to look at. This is just the ethics, but I do want to move on to Kant and Schopenhauer. Anyway, Spinoza won't stop. It will continue in the form of minutiae. The podcasts I produce on just literally a sentence or two here or there out of Spinoza. But then I shall move on to Kant. Now, I've thought long and hard about Kant because I think if I was to try and go through Kant, say for a period of 6-7 months or however long, you might just lose the will to live. Not everyone likes to sort of dwell on each particular statement in the way I do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to produce 3 or 4 overviews, which will be May, June time next year. These will give us enough to get into Schopenhauer. Because as Schopenhauer says, a prerequisite for understanding his work is to understand at least something about Kant. Now, let me say a few things about Kant and I'll say a few things about Schopenhauer. All these people are very different. Kant was... Well, let me tell you a little story. I was, for a while, engaged with a number of people, and I'm not going to say who, but a number of people who were involved in very high cultural activities within Europe. Kant was regarded as almost like sacred work. It was almost like the real meaning of Kant was secret knowledge for them, almost like the Masons or something. Anyway, I wasn't party to too much of that, so I didn't really glean all that much from it, but it gives you a measure of how Kant is regarded. And just give me a minute or two to indulge myself. I've said before that Spinoza and Kant are almost impenetrable philosophers. Their works are almost impenetrable. As somebody commented actually in I think it was a comment or an email they sent, that Spinoza hasn't been bastardized yet. The New Ages or the self-help people or whoever haven't got hold of it yet. Well, they haven't got hold of it because they can't understand it, probably anyway. The same is not true with the Stoics. Stoicism is now very fashionable. It's been bastardized. It will cause more harm than good. But there's good stuff in the Stoics. It's just a shame that people turn it into self-help nonsense. Anyway, Spinoza and Kant have not been bastardized. Now, Gurdjieff talked about legomenisms. And legomenisms are documents or teachings that are passed down through the ages in a manner where they cannot, or it becomes very difficult to bastardize them. Spinoza's document is impenetrable, I think, for a very good reason. He just didn't want people taking it and mucking about with it. And the same with Kant. Kant is even more impenetrable. An interesting thing about Kant is that The academics read it, and it's an academic's delight because it's full of all strange words and ideas, and they can catalogue it and all that kind of thing that they like doing. But if you read the academics on Kant, they just don't get it. They don't really get what he's saying. And in a very broad brushstroke, let me just say what I think anyway Kant is saying. Kant is saying that actually our normal faculties are very limited, and he defines the limits of them. But in defining the limits of them, he opens a whole other world up that we think we already understand or know about, but we don't. So his critique of pure reason does most of that work. The expansion into the territory that we don't know about is his other work, the critique of practical reason. So there's a huge amount of work to do on Kant. You know, it's years worth of stuff. I don't know if anybody who's listening to this will be around in years' time, but the bottom line is I shall study this stuff until my last breath, because it's, as far as I'm concerned, both Spinoza and Kant, less so with Schopenhauer, but both with Spinoza and Kant, they hold the keys to the kingdom in terms of my own understanding. Now, as you can see, I've got a quote here from Gurdjieff. Now, as you probably know, Gurdjieff trashed everything. Gurdjieff could not admit that anybody knew anything more than he knew. You know, he trashed science, he trashed psychology, he trashed theology, he trashed philosophy, you name it, he trashed it, and claimed that he had the only real, unique and true knowledge in the whole wide world. So for him to say, if Kant had introduced the idea of scale into his arguments, many things he wrote would have been very valuable, is a huge compliment from Gurdjieff. I mean, he was never going to say, oh yeah, Kant had got it. He wasn't going to say that, because he didn't say that about anything or anybody. And that was Gurdjieff's. I don't really quite know why he did that. Maybe it was just one of his selling points. I don't really know. But for him to admit that Kant, and Ouspensky was a great fan of Kant. You know, there's very deep understanding in Kant, but it is not communicated easily. So to give an overview of Kant, for 3 or 4 overviews, and then go into the minutiae is the best way to approach it. The best way to eat Kant is one spoonful at a time, and Kant is a whale. You know, Spinoza is an elephant, but Kant is a whale. And then, I don't know, probably round about June, July, we'll get on to Schopenhauer proper. Now, Schopenhauer is much more approachable. We won't start with the world as will and representation because, again, as he says, we need to understand his fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. What a title. We do need to understand that before we get into his world as will and representation. So we need to understand some Kant, and we need to understand what was his doctoral thesis, the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. And Schopenhauer is a different bag altogether than Spinoza and Kant. Schopenhauer is very profound in his own way, and as you know, his main idea was simply this. Kant said we cannot know reality, we cannot know the thing in itself. Schopenhauer said yes we can, it's will. The will to life, that is the thing in itself. Personally, I don't think Schopenhauer had the whole picture there, for reasons that we can get into another time. But he highlighted a very, very big thing, a major thing. So the world is will and representation. Is gives a fairly comprehensive overview of how the world is the world that we perceive is not the world as it really is. So that's the plan for 2019. As I say, I might do one more podcast in the next few days on Spinoza's treatment of imagination. And then that will be it until next year. Anyway, there will be at least one podcast, imagination, or simply just to wish everybody a happy holiday or whatever. Anyway, I hope that's useful.